Thank you very much, and welcome to our final panel session of the day. As we think about everything we've heard here today, there's clearly plenty of excitement still ahead for us in the DAM world. And one of the lessons we might take away is how important it is to be ready for that excitement, ready for that change. People expect any content, anytime, anywhere. That's consumers, of course, but others too, marketers, communications people, even those of us who are employees of a firm expect to find corporate content on our terms, whatever those are. The word agility has come up in every session today. Maybe fair to say that the consumer content is the most visible space there, and over the last year, the most successful content providers are those who are already ready with asset libraries and those with the agility to bring fresh content quickly and deliver in new ways. And so we end here today with a panel bringing together some of the key leaders behind those successful content pivots to share some of their insights into what it takes to build a content asset operation for the 2020s. We have Christina Aguilera, Head of Creative Engineering at Amazon Studios, Kendall Ginsbach, Digital Media Architect at the National Football League, and Matt Westrup, VP of Technology and Operations for A&E Networks UK. And let's start maybe with some quick introductions from each of you and learn a little bit about your DAM worlds, and maybe hear how each of you would characterize agility. What does it mean for each of your worlds? Maybe Christina, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I am Christina Aguilera, and I actually have a new title. So I am now the head of technology, workflow, and strategy for Amazon Studios, which is awesome. I previously had a purview over the creative pipeline, and now I get to look at the full life cycle from ideation through distribution to look at technology across asset management processes from ideation through distribution is really rewarding to have that holistic view. And my team is looking at capturing all of the metrics and data points and current state so that as we evolve and as we make adjustments at Amazon, then we can directly show real value that is delivered to the end users. So it's a really exciting place to be. It's a fun place to innovate and be creative. And I'm excited to be here today to talk with everyone. I think when we think about agility and how ultimately from a media and entertainment perspective we can accommodate agility, it's all about the interoperability across our platforms and our platforms being able to talk to each other so that we have those smooth workflows from an end user perspective, and we can have those efficiency gains and accommodate some automated capabilities. So I think the interoperability side of it really leads to agility. So as long as we have a common source of truth when it comes to content, being flexible on the front end for the many different experiences across the entire pipeline is really important.
I think that's definitely a theme we'll come back to in a moment. Kendall, tell us about your world.
Yeah, hi, Graham. So Kendall Ginsbach, I run a program called the Digital Content Library, or DCL. We love acronyms at the NFL, which is the central archive for the league. So by definition, we have to be agile since we have to integrate with all of the business units throughout the organization. When you're integrating with NFL networks or NFL films, that's going to be a different set of tools that are being used, different set of connectors, and even different metadata schemas that have to be mapped and associated with. So agility has been present as a driving force behind our deployment and implementation from the very get-go. It's all been about how do we make ourselves nimble for change? How do we set ourselves up to be able to adapt whenever there are new needs from the business and be able to integrate extremely quickly with those needs? So yeah, that's really what we're about. You know, I mean, pandemic obviously is something that people come back to frequently, but I like to say that we built this system not for a pandemic, but it sure came in handy during that. So, you know, having been ahead of the curve there, I guess, with a system that's accessible remotely, that was built for content creators to be able to keep touch with the content no matter where they are directly from a web-based UI. Definitely a very critical piece there, and hugely successful for us in this past year.
Yeah, yes, being change ready was certainly handy when a pandemic came along, and perhaps a pandemic coming along has been quite handy in influencing some change. Matt, how about your world? Tell us about your world.
Hi, Graham. So I look after the technology and teams for A&E networks that underpin the content supply chain, the post-production for creative, the distribution, IT, engineering, localization, compliance. So, you know, a sort of fairly typical supply chain for a broadcaster. We have a fairly significant channel portfolio distribution across EMEA, but also a very rapidly growing digital distribution as well. And the interplay of those two worlds is where DAM and MAM really come into their own. And I think there are lots of useful and interesting aspects and definitions of Agile. I think you're going to hear lots of different versions of what Agile is. But I think I know when we're being Agile, when you're asked to do something new and you don't have to get new people in and you don't resort to spreadsheets and you don't have to start from scratch, that you sort of have something that you can adapt to that very, very quickly. And usually it's sort of data-centric operations, going back to the automation that Christina was saying. So taking good care of your metadata means that you have a better chance of being agile, but it also means that you know when you're not being agile, perhaps, and therefore where to think about what you need to change.
Well, I think data is something else we'll maybe come back to. Well, Christina, let's maybe go back to your point about interoperability. You know, how have you found, what have you found was effective in just having a strategy of interoperability and making it happen? Because it's, you know, sometimes easier to say than to do in real life.
It's definitely a complex problem to solve for. I think the value comes when you don't make a single experience too overwhelming for an end user. It's all about simplicity and security for media and entertainment. The processes have to be simple, which means that they need to be driven towards what our customers need and what our users are trying to accomplish. Ultimately, our job is to make their lives easier. So if we make a single experience too overwhelming by adding too much functionality onto it, then it ends up being an experience that the users don't want to adopt, which makes it more challenging. So from an interoperability standpoint, by having a source of truth from a back-end content perspective and having the flexibility of either a custom solution or a third-party solution to sit on top of that to accommodate the needs of that particular use case, we have a lot more flexibility to solve problems easily. But it's not easy, because working across these various systems and having them connect to each other and talk to each other in a simplistic way needs to be well thought out. It's not a fast solution. It's definitely something that needs to be holistic in approach and well defined early on.
I think Christina's point is really good about that. Oh, sorry, I think Christina's point about, you know, the experiences is really good. It's, you know, you can't try to be one size fits all. And in large organizations, you've got a lot of different needs that are present and represented. And if you try to serve them all through one platform, through one environment, you can create more complexity than you're creating efficiency. So, you know, agility can be to say, okay, well, there are actually needs that are very specific for this area and this area. I need to create the base on which we're going to be able to integrate these systems and ensure that that happens seamlessly so that we don't continue perpetuating content silos in different parts of the business. And so the agility can be at many different levels. It can be one system in the way that that one system works, but it can also be an ecosystem of systems and the way that they all work together to be tuned to each other, have the same metadata taxonomies working together, but then pertaining to the very specific needs of a business. And I think that that's something that is important to bring up. Trying to be everything to everyone once again usually can result in actually diluting down the system to a point where, well, you're really not serving anyone in a great way.
I think that's absolutely right. And Christina, when you talk about thinking hard about your interoperability, that's the job of, you know, it's difficult to create simplicity from what is actually quite a complex, because no one ever gets a greenfield. Everybody's got their legacy systems. Everything's moving from something to something else, and to be able to have that freedom, to be able to have those really data and content flowing between systems and different processes is the key, because you risk, I think, Kendall, to your point, you risk delivering a technical solution but not necessarily a business success.
So in this sort of notion of interoperability rather than, you know, one system to rule them all, coming back, Matt, to your earlier point, how do you tackle things like data quality? How do you tackle things like sources of truth? How would you recommend our audience think about the data side of this?
So you tackle it with relentless focus and prepared to go backwards before you can go forwards. It is the hardest thing. And I speak as that as I'm not an expert in this by any means. But I think firstly, you've got to, you know, my job is to ensure the rest of the business understand that this is a priority, and that can be a hard sell sometimes. So that's job number one. I think job number two then is to, you know, accept once that's a focus, to not bite off more than you can chew, because, you know, if you're going to say we're going to fix our data, I mean, that's a kind of it's a program, not a project. It could be a lifetime's work. So you have to be quite targeted about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, because you can end up creating a bigger mess than you're sorting out. But, you know, the clear point about having, you know, a clean set of metadata to drive automation is, and therefore agility is absolutely key. But also in your interoperability, you're not having to rework things every time. But it's an uneven. You're going to start off with an uneven playing field completely, because, you know, data over time hasn't behaved, and so you do need to be relentlessly focused on it, but to manage your expectations about what's achievable.
I think that another point,
Christina,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. No, Kendall, go ahead.
I was just going to say another thing is incremental. You know, focused and incremental. If you take it one piece of the puzzle at a time, then you have a much better chance of success rather than going for the, you know, for the immediate touchdown. Sorry, I have to use some sports analogies. But, you know, I mean, if you try to go for the entire thing immediately, then chances are that you're, you know, some people with their legacy systems are probably going to be resistant to some of that change. And then you can end up diluting the message, whereas some incremental strategic steps that start setting up the process, creating success and showing how useful it can be is one of the ways that you can go about that I think like breeds the success and starts bringing people towards that central platform and central way of doing things, because they start seeing how efficient it is, and so they want to be a part of it, for one thing.
Yeah, I think it's really important to accommodate a phased approach in any sort of change management situation. It can be overwhelming with the massive scope of trying to make changes across these types of processes. And from a taxonomy perspective, an initial stage, you really have to identify that consolidated taxonomy across your full end-to-end life cycle with the definition of the authoritative sources. I've seen historically practices where there's multiple places where different fields and values can be changed along the way. But you need to protect that integrity of the data in order to ensure that the clean data and the automation can be successful. Because if you end up with values and information and data across the content that isn't necessarily accurate based on practices that could be improved, then the automation that it gets triggered from the metadata may not always be accurate. So it's important to look at it from a quality perspective early on so that we can be proactive instead of reactive to these scenarios.
One thing I've experienced as well is trying to avoid the expertise around data needs to be a silo, because there's getting your taxonomy right and your systems right is that's you really do need to have real experts on that. But in terms of data, trying to avoid data being a silo within an organization really helps, because there are so many people that contribute to the quality of that metadata in an organization that may not even realize that's what they're doing. And so you need to find ways to bring them into that without, again, kind of putting barriers of language or technology in the way, but to also demonstrate the business value of getting it right, and what right looks like. So, and I'm sure Ken and Christina have both got loads of experience of working with people to do that. But that's certainly something I found is important in getting this right.
It is, and also there's a lot of ownership and just passion around people's data. They love their data. They're very passionate about it. And when we need to consider an open model where multiple people are participating and multiple groups have ownership, then it requires some mechanisms around some governance and just transparency in the communications so that everyone is participating and has that sense of ownership along the way, because it's not something that can be changed from a one-sided perspective. It's something that needs to be participated on from the many groups that have ownership across data across the entire life cycle.
How do you find you bring people in on that journey? Because that's actually really important. And the word governance is not necessarily a helpful word, right? It can scare people away.
It can.
So how have you found that you were able to bring people along on that journey? Because I think as you say, it's absolutely critical.
And for us, it's all about transparency in your communications and involvement from early on. As soon as you want to start planning and putting in that foundation, then everyone needs to be participating and everyone needs to be involved. If you continue down a path where you're potentially working in more of a silo, then you risk having to then take 10 steps back down the road because the right people weren't involved from the beginning. So it really is ensuring the collaboration, transparency, and communication early on, from my perspective.
Although I'd argue the word governance does need to be said out loud sometimes, because you need to be able to understand, the gravity of getting this right, and if you've identified it as a focus and a priority amongst teams. So you're right. You've got. I think it's an important point about people are passionate about data. Actually, I think that's absolutely right. But you do need some ownership to be able to define and then sometimes impose and police best practice to keep that up. So I'd argue there's carrot and stick involved there, although the balance is key.
The narrative has also evolved over the last few years. I recall some years back where I'd end up in meetings where I'd bring up metadata And pretty much as soon as meh came out of my mouth, like everybody was like, oh, here he goes again. Like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to listen to this. But it's, knowing your audience as well, and who it is that you're speaking to in the organization. There's a point that Christina made about ownership of the content, but that's an extremely powerful thing. There's a workflow that we actually developed for our editors in Mexico City, where previously it went through multiple different places and multiple different groups to actually eventually be posted online and through Dropboxes and et cetera. And we turned that into a process where they upload it directly into the digital content library and can apply the metadata themselves. And we've seen them be extremely eager to apply the metadata to that content, which is then archived in that location and available in perpetuity to be able to go back to and reference. So putting that into their hands with clear boundaries, right? We set the metadata, we gave them access to metadata forms that are specifically curated to their needs and that we worked on with them. But that creates a big incentive for them. I mean, they feel like they're the ones who are taking care of that rather than their content going through 5 different hands. And by the time you get to that 5th pair of hands, I mean, ownership of that isn't really a big thing at that point anymore. It's just about getting the job done and getting it delivered. So if you're able to bring it closer to the originator of the content, I think is also a very powerful tool towards enabling them and making them a part of that process.
I think that's a great challenge. A great point actually is that the people sometimes best placed to contribute to metadata within systems and police it are the ones that really know their stuff. And sometimes that, you need to work to avoid a silo where it's passed down to more junior people that don't have that expertise, because that story when you sort of said you're trying to convince people, you get through meta before people start switching off, selling that in, because actually you can demonstrate most people in a business are contributing to metadata. They just call it rights in contracts, or they call it QC data, or they call it a script, or they call it whatever, so actually it is about trying to reframe it rather than reinvent it sometimes.
I also think it's really important for us to make sure that we are involving them across the process. I think traditionally, historically, there's been some methodologies around, like, if you build it, they will come. And that isn't necessarily the most effective, because if you build it and you're not building it with them directly next to you, then you could be building things that make their life more challenging. So it's really important for us to make sure that as we're building things and as we're configuring the solutions, that they're right there next to us and helping us define exactly what their experience should be to keep it simple.
Yeah, so it's one of the first things we do is we try and capture user stories for exactly that point. And again, it's a balance, because you've still got to create a solution on a budget and a timeline with clear engineering principles. But you're right, if you build it and they come, then it's got to be useful to start with.
How do you recommend people think about balancing the forces from multiple different teams or multiple different sources or multiple different stakeholders? Because I think you've all talked about multiple dimensions of the human factor here. Being agile is not just about having agile technology and systems. It's an awful lot about the people ecosystem. So how do you recommend looking at a big ecosystem of stakeholders and working through priorities, working through keeping them all on the train, as you maybe can't necessarily satisfy them all at once?
For me, I've looked at our stakeholder groups slightly different, and that's what I found most successful. So instead of looking at individual teams and solving for problems as teams define them, then I look at it by functionality. So we want a simple search. Let's gather together all of the stakeholders that use search in many different ways, and let's gather their feedback. And then let's look at the ingest process, and let's look at the distribution process. But not everyone is ingesting, but let's gather the groups together that do need to have those automated ingest processes and the manual and bulk ingest processes, so that we can solve for multiple groups in a simplistic way that makes sense for all of them, instead of solving it multiple times for each individual group. So I try to look at it by functionality rather than individual teams across a large organization.
We took it from the angle of kind of setting up an operating committee with the key members from the stakeholder groups. Now, yeah, I mean, you have to think about this in the context of like large organization where we're trying to make very different needs all jive together. And so we tried to bring everybody together in an operating committee. We get together once a month. These are key stakeholders, and we talk about the priorities that we have, and we make everybody a part of that so that they understand the priorities that we're working on. They can hear it from the mouth of the other stakeholders, and we make it a very transparent process, so that you don't have one sitting on one side wondering, well, why are my projects getting pushed down and the other one is pushing all of their projects. That was one step that we took towards transparency, and then breaking out that operating committee into some specific sessions when we need to have architectural reviews or look at a specific technology or assess some of the priorities. That's one of the optics that we chose to take.
I'm not sure there is a key, a one template for success, because what you're talking about, Graham, it is complicated getting, especially in big organizations as well. And we're a relatively smaller organization, and we still find that tough. But I would say elements from both of those. I think that the user story and bringing people in who feel they're being listened to and feel that they're contributing to something. It means you then have equity to be able to go, right, okay, this is the difficult bit where we have to do a bit of technology, a bit of engineering, and you're going to have to bear with us, and you're going to help us test it, please, because we're not going to test it for you, because that isn't going to work. But I love a good steering committee, right? But I think that 90% of all of this is about people from start, beginning, and end. Never ever lose focus on that, because you'll fail, I think. But I love a good steering committee, because you're going to have to manage expectations. You're learning together. You're going to be worse at it before you're better at it. That's probably a universal truth. And you need to be growing up. You need to have those big conversations. And a steering committee is just not a show and tell about, this is what I've achieved this week, or, are we aligned? But, let's solve problems together as well. Let's be open and honest about, what our thoughts are on this. So I think it's putting the people in front of the technology often is a helpful guide.
I actually have an interestingly specific question that's come in from the audience, picking up on Matt, what you just said, and then something you had mentioned earlier about sometimes the first step is a backwards step, or can be a backwards step. So, tips for keeping stakeholders engaged when maybe the first step or two is backwards, or certainly not forwards.
Okay, I'll go. Since there's my comment, I better have an answer to that then. I think first, one of the things that when we've been through, and they tend to be the bigger projects, I guess, but we try and maybe keep the same spirit, is that you have a kind of a culture around change and projects that is recognizable in wherever you are in the business. And that's not necessarily always a written down thing, but sometimes it can be. One thing we try and do is apply it to the values. I mean, we've all got values in our business, and actually, why don't you try and let your values speak to change, and then that's something that's common across groups. But one of the most useful things that I was taught by someone else was about that kind of strategic change of the curve of change, where you're going to be really good at doing the wrong things as you go through change, and then you're going to be kind of worse at doing the right things. And if you before then you become really good at doing the right things. But if you have that kind of conversation first, that helps set the tone, and you're not sort of saying, oh, this is going to be bad, but you are saying this is going to be realistic, and it helps you, again, kind of gain a bit of equity to help you through where it's not working. Because people, you know, Ken, as you were saying, people get switched off by the complexity. I mean, how many people want to sort of say something's been delayed because you found a problem in your taxonomy, or you found a problem in the API, or whatever it is? I mean, those are stuff that's hard to surface and explain. So, but in the general context of change, that change isn't necessarily straightforward, but it does take everybody's input to make it through to the other side. And I think that's the key thing, is making that bridge between not just the project teams who are going to be delivering it, but everybody that has a vested interest in that, and the stakeholders aren't just waiting for something to happen.
One of the approaches that I found successful is also to run some parallel tracks. So when you know that one track is going to potentially be more time consuming or be a longer road to seeing that value delivered, then I often run a parallel track to that where we can identify some quick wins, where they can start to see some temporary relief while that larger effort is being built on the side. And being transparent about that along the way, and, you know, open in your communications about the value being planned and the relief that can be had now versus in the future. Sometimes it requires some, I hate to say it, but Band-Aid type fixes initially to release some of the pressure, so that there is that sense of relief while you are doing something that you're potentially starting off backwards, or you're potentially looking at a long path forward before any relief is felt.
I think it's all, I mean, also very contingent on being able to share the vision in a way that it represents, well, here are the benefits that you're going to get once we go through a little bit of difficulty, right? But being very transparent about the process and what it's going to be, and make the different groups partners to that process, so that they also feel coming out of it that it's absolutely their success. It's not just the technologists that have come up with something and, oh, isn't that magical? No, it's also about them, and they're the ones who helped guide that vision to success. So, you know, I mean, I know that's a little bit general, but I think it's extremely important to make sure they understand where we're going and what the steps along the way are going to be to get to there. And that it may be a little bit tricky at times. It may be a little bit difficult, but here are the areas that are a dependency. Here are the areas that are a little bit of a complicated achievement. And then I think everybody just, you know, can be partners towards succeeding.
I'd add to that, Kendall, that in that vision piece, not to confuse functionality with vision, because functionality can be very easily overpromised and underdelivered, and it's not actually the point you're trying to make. It is about a vision. But I think also, again, getting out the side of, as you say, from technologists and those teams, because, you know, the change is the job of work, is the mode for increasingly for all of us, and that relationship with technology and change has to be brought in across the business.
A couple of you mentioned legacy earlier. You know, how much of a barrier is legacy, and how do you recommend that people overcome that? And it could be legacy process as well as legacy technology.
I mean, legacy is part of the history. It's part of the way things were done. And I mean, you should take that into account in the way that you're evolving things. I mean, there's a reason why it was done a certain way. So trying to understand that, associate that to the direction that you're taking, I think is an important step. And understanding what increments you can apply towards making that change. Maybe there are some cases where it has to be a radical change, and maybe there are some cases where it has to be an incremental change that has to be applied. But it's really understanding what scenario it is that's applying, and not just using a one-size-fits-all approach to every one of the problems that we're facing. For those integrations, you know, we've tried to be very creative in the way that we challenge, take on these challenges. try to use technology, try to use creativity, but also really just try to understand where we're coming from and where we're going.
I think we're also at a point where transitioning from legacy methodologies is refreshing. So there is a large value proposition towards being more agile and working towards more of that interoperability approach instead of the single monolithic solution. So when we are communicating about transitioning from legacy approaches, it can be refreshing, and it can be something that the users are looking forward to, and will give them a lot of efficiencies and increased capacity, and really start to put them in that right direction that they can look forward to. So I don't think, while from a technology standpoint it's challenging, I definitely think it's the right direction that everyone can look forward to.
Legacy bites you. It's the thing that's waiting, in the dark somewhere to come out and scare you. And it's the thing that'll make you groan when you find it, because it's not necessarily because you've done, to your point, Kendall, it's not necessarily because people did the wrong thing before. There was a time, believe it or not, when monolithic systems were in vogue. And you maybe we're just building the legacy of tomorrow, but it is, again, it is going to go and annoy you in your perfect world, because you have to adapt. You can't always solve it, and sometimes if you're going to make it better, those are the hard miles that I found anyway with legacy, because with your interoperability point, it doesn't neatly fit something, and so you've got to rip it up and start again, or you've got to live with it. But I think, to go back to your vision piece, if you sort of have your true north, if you kind of know what good looks like, then when you get those opportunities, you nudge it in that direction. And sometimes you need a big bang, sometimes you just need to switch something off. Actually, I think as well, it's a very dynamic environment that we're in, even with mergers and acquisitions, and the vendor community changing a lot, and you can get legacy imposed on you for all sorts of reasons, because people stop doing stuff, stop supporting stuff, buy stuff down, shut stuff down. And so you never know when you're going to have to deal with it. And there's, yes, once you've got everything in a center of truth with microservices around it in the cloud, then you can immunize yourself against it to a degree. But no one I've spoken to in the industry doesn't have, to greater or lesser extent, having to deal with living with legacy. I think let's call it that.
I love that line, we're building the legacy of tomorrow. I think you should trademark that, make some money off of it. We're not too far away from the end of our time slot here. We have a question that has come in about AI and machine learning, and we talked a bit about that on the earlier innovations panel. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the application of more advanced technologies to enable the concepts of agility, and perhaps being by extension automation? Where are we on that curve, and what do you recommend our audience think about in that space?
I think our best opportunity right now from an AI and machine learning perspective is around auto tagging of our descriptive metadata, because once we have high quality metadata around being able to search and retrieve our content, it opens up so many more new opportunities to leverage our content in new and exciting ways. But manually tagging descriptive metadata is consuming. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of people. So by filling that gap through AI and machine learning and training those models to your specific IP, it opens up so many opportunities that have not previously been there. And it's definitely something that is available now. And I would say 5 years ago, we all wanted to do it, but the technology wasn't there, and now it is. So that's exciting.
That is spot on. We care for content. That's our job. And in a increasingly streaming-based age, that your archive is becoming far more important. and the way that it is served up and thought of in different ways. And it's not just about automation, it's about insight and discoverability, understanding what you have and suggesting things that you didn't know were there, and easing its path to market. So I think there's a lot in what Christina says, but I think with machine learning, really more than AI perhaps, there are other key areas as well in the localization space, I think, where it's, again, a couple of years ago, it's close, but is it close enough? And I'm seeing now we're using it in small parts now with third parties, and very effectively so. But I think it will become part of the fabric of your DAM rather than, again, a kind of silo, because, you know, as Christina says, it's the job of training it is you know, it needs to be ready to be released before you take it on, because it could be expensive.
And that's the point I'll bounce off of, the training of those models. I mean, we're talking about agility, we're talking about efficiency. Obviously, having tools that allow us to generate hundreds of data points on content is massively valuable. But what are those hundreds of data points? How valuable are they? And how do they affect the searchability of your content in the system? If you're creating false positives because of the amount that's coming in, or because the AI wasn't correct, et cetera, that's one step that I've been pretty big about, is how do you validate the AI before you unleash it onto your MAM or DAM, where then it's going to be searched on? I think is kind of an important point to keep in mind, because you're going to get a ton of results, but how do you process those results and apply them to the content in a productive fashion for your business is something to really keep in mind, I think, and that we have kept in mind as kind of a first step there as we look at applying AI ML in our systems.
And this is a similar topic that I heard come up a little bit earlier today in a different session, was just the potential that AI and ML are potentially replacing jobs. And that's not really the case from my perspective. It's really about the roles are changing. So rather than the roles manually tagging all this information from the use case that we're discussing right now, those roles are QCing the data coming in to make sure that we have a level of accuracy that we're comfortable with, to ensure that our workflows and automation and everything that we're working towards is the level of quality that we would expect.
It is absolutely about releasing time and talent from your teams. Change is hard, and you've employed smart people who can be adding value to your business, and you want to release them to be able to add that value.
That's actually a great note, I think, for us to end the panel on, because that's been a truth for a great deal of the technology delivered or technology inspired change in asset management for years. That it's never been about making the people eliminating jobs or making the people go away. It has always been about shifting the focus, shifting the effort into more value add, more business value, and AI and ML is no different there. Well, how can it be we've run out of time already? Thank you so much to Matt and Kendall and Christina. Clearly we could keep talking about this for quite a while longer if we were allowed to, but we're not going to be allowed to. Because that does amazingly conclude our presentations and panels for the day already. DAM is clearly just as vibrant a discipline for M&E as it has been for years. And it's really fantastic to see sort of the innovation and futurism for content and content management showing no signs of slowing down. We hope that everybody has enjoyed this short but lively expedition